Good. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ian Jones. I work for JTI, based in Japan. So I'm a little bit jet lagged, so please bear with me. We have a rather packed agenda today. This is the first time, I believe, that GFN has tried to hold these science labs sessions, so it'll be interesting to see how this goes. We have a panel of 5 distinguished presenters today. We have 1.5 hours, so round about 18 minutes each. And I will be harsh on time, otherwise Sood, who's the last speaker, will kill me if I squeeze his time too much. So without much further ado, I'm going to keep the introductions relatively brief so that we maximize the time for presentations and for Q&A. If you want to learn more about the speakers, in the GFN booklet, there's more details. So the first presenter today is Carrie Wade from PMI. Carrie's the head of scientific engagement. And the presentation is on estimating HPHC, that's potentially harmful constituent exposure on a per stick basis. So we start with the presentation.
Hi, my name is Carrie Wade, and I'm the head of scientific engagement at PMI. As tobacco products continue to evolve towards non-combustible products, there is an opportunity to move entirely away from the most harmful products that require combustion to deliver nicotine. This transition can benefit adult smokers who don't quit by reducing their exposure to harmful and potentially harmful constituents that are known to be present in smoke. To understand the individual risk of these newer smoke-free products, it is necessary to directly compare the emissions of toxicants in aerosol with those present in cigarette smoke, and to understand how these products are used by people who switch from cigarettes to non-combustible products. Today, I will show a per-stick comparison of HPHC exposure from heated tobacco product THS versus a cigarette. Our targeted analysis studies show that emissions of HPHCs are reduced on average by 95% in THS compared with cigarettes. Here we see a side-by-side or stick-by-stick comparison between THS and a 3R4F reference cigarette. Depending on the disease category, the reduction in HPHC formation is between 92 and 97%. However, it has been suggested that a stick-by-stick comparison may be inappropriate, as a THS heat stick contains between 3.2 and 3.6 times less tobacco than a cigarette. While evaluating HPHC emissions based on tobacco weight may be appropriate in some instances, we can look to our clinical studies to understand why a stick-by-stick comparison is appropriate to estimate differences in exposure to THS aerosol versus a cigarette. When looking at exposure to HPHCs, our clinical studies show that biomarker levels are reduced in those who switch to THS compared to continued smoking. Here we see carboxyhemoglobin, a biomarker of exposure to carbon monoxide, decreased in those who switch to THS to levels comparable with those who abstained from smoking. When we extend this to the 15 biomarkers of exposure measured in the study, we could see similar patterns. Following 90 days of switching or abstinence, biomarkers of exposure across were significantly reduced compared to continued smoking. Furthermore, 14 of these biomarkers are not significantly different between those who switched to THS compared to those who abstained from smoking. While it is clear that switching from cigarettes to THS reduces exposure to HPHCs as measured by biomarkers of exposure, we also need to consider how people use the products to make a direct correlation of emissions to exposure on a per-stick basis. First, evaluating nicotine levels following product use, we see that the use of one cigarette or heat stick results in similar nicotine levels in the blood despite the differences in tobacco weight. Looking at product use in the longer term, clinical study data show that during the first 5 days of switching, nicotine exposure is lower than in those who continue to smoke, despite using more cigarettes, as we see in the right figure. However, following a period of acclimation to the product, we see that both groups have similar nicotine exposure and use similar number of sticks per day. Furthermore, the groups that switched to THS return to baseline levels of sticks per day. Taking into account nicotine exposure and product use characteristics, clinical studies show similar patterns between the two groups despite a difference in tobacco weight per stick. To conclude, the comparisons between different products should be informed by use characteristics. These use characteristics, such as nicotine uptake, can then inform how different products, including products within the same broad category, such as heated tobacco products, can be compared in terms of HPHC deliveries. Thank you.
Wow, packed room. Okay, we have time for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? The presentation? Yeah, I have one. I'll extend my role to microphone.
There are often criticism coming up. Yes, but what about other harmful substances? Do you have any data on other harmful substances except for those also present in tobacco smoke?
Is it on? Oh, okay, great. So this presentation was in response to a few articles that have considered that we are underestimating our HPHC exposure by 3.2 times. And these two articles, one was from Aguna and Snape, and one was which referenced an article from Our. And these were published in 2022. Well, one of them, Aguna and Snape, was published in 2022. And this had been picked up in media it continues to live on the statement of underestimating HPHCs by 3.2 times. But to be clear, we do a complete characterization of the aerosol from IQOS. And so our aerosol chemistry studies show that when we're doing now I'm blanking on the term, I can't remember, I'm sorry. But when you do an analysis, a targeted analysis, thank you, sorry for that. When we do our targeted analysis to look at what's in the HPHC list from different regulatory agencies, we do see about a 95% on average reduction. When we do an untargeted analysis or non-targeted analysis to look at what's different at certain thresholds between the cigarette smoke and the IQOS aerosol, we also see that the aerosol is much less complex. And what's in anything that is above or unique to IQOS aerosol, there's not many compounds. There's about 50 compounds, and all of them were under the threshold of 100 nanograms per item. And they only 4 of them were of toxicological concern, but only at levels that were higher than present in the IQOS aerosol. So we do a complete characterization, not just a characterization between cigarettes and what's known in cigarettes. That makes sense. I think I answered your question.
Thank you, Carrie. Any other questions? Okay, whilst you're thinking about it, I'll take the liberty of asking you a question, Carrie. Okay. So you presented biomarkers of exposure. So for those that are not familiar, these are markers in the body that demonstrate that you've been exposed to compound. Have you looked at the other type of biomarker, which is biomarkers of potential harm, which could be markers of, let's say, early disease progression?
Yes, we have conducted studies on biomarkers of potential harm, and there's 8 biomarkers of potential harm that we've studied. These are chosen based on their known link to the development of smoking-related disease and the pathogenesis of disease. In all of our studies, people who had switched completely from cigarettes to IQOS had improvements towards the direction of cessation and changes towards the direction of cessation in the biomarkers of potential harm. 5 of 8, and these are looking at inflammation and lipid metabolism, things like that are leading to pathogenesis. And in 5 of the 8 biomarkers of potential harm, there was a significant difference between smoking, between when they were smoking and at the time points that we looked at. But these studies, the differences this was not enough to convince like the FDA when we did our application for the MRTP to give us that claim of reduced harm. So we're hoping to get that in a time period when you have enough time behind the studies to make a full conclusion.
Thank you, Carrie. Anybody thought of a question? Robert, yes, please. Microphone in front of you.
It's on. Okay. Now the question is the samples of where you get the biomarkers of abstinence and the sample of IQOS users. Are these samples equivalent?
What, like taken at the same time points?
Yeah, and also because the issue is that biomarkers can also come from other environmental.
Right.
So it's important to have a sample that will somehow hide this or deal with it, control this.
I mean, presumably people in the three arms of the studies, continued smoking, switching, and abstinence, are exposed to the same environmental.
Yeah.
So that would be reflected in the biomarkers of exposure in all groups, across all groups, and not significantly different between those groups and what they're exposed to in their world. And what we saw is when you're just taking into account the people in the abstinence arm and the people in the switching arm, there were similar decreases in the biomarkers of exposure compared to those who were in the continued smoking group. But I think it's an underlying assumption that in those studies, people are exposed to the same outside, harms.
Yeah, it's a matter of control. Yeah. I agree. Yes, understand. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Bengt. My exercise.
We both need it. Bengt Wiberg from Sweden. This is a theoretical consumer question. PMI recommend that the heat sticks is used with the IQOS device. Mm-hmm. Have you studied what happens if you put a PMI heat stick in another heat not burn device? Does that increase risks or something? Do you have any facts on that?
You can't do that. It wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Like the way the heat sticks are designed would not work in a different device, and same for other sticks in other heat. No, it. All right, I stand corrected. I'd be curious to know how, and I would like to hear more about that. But the temperature control of the device would be the important factor in what you're exposed to. This in a different device. If you're going from the IQOS device to, I don't know, a plume device or whatever would work, whatever that temperature control is of that device would be what would determine how much HPHCs. Our devices are meant to be controlled at levels or degrees below 400 degrees Celsius.
Okay, thank you. We have time
but the
for
newer,
one...
I would like to add that I would like to talk to you because I would think that the newer devices probably wouldn't work with the susceptor and the inductive.
Yeah. Thank you. We have time for one last quick question if anyone has a question. If not, I'm going to take the liberty of asking a very poignant question. Do you think, you mentioned the FDA earlier and the comments you received during your application to the FDA. Do you think they will ever, let's say, authorize a reduced risk product in the absence of epidemiological data or real world evidence?
I think that's a question for the FDA. I'm not sure. Yeah. I would like to think that we could get that not just PMI, but other companies as well, could get that claim once there is enough epidemiological evidence just for the category in general. Yeah.
It worked for snus.
Yeah, exactly. It works for snus, and that would be important to help people. And I was going to say something else, but then it escaped my brain.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you very much. Thank you.